I have been privileged to be able to have been able to give, since I was inducted in 1992 on a continual basis, over time, is able to increase my contributions. And I did become a Einstein member, and just having that statue is in my living room at a main place is a continual reminder of what the NAE does. It's all people, and it's, you know, the people have good ideas, and there's a variety of ideas, and the NAE has ability both for its members and also for non-members to be a great convener for solving problems. This year, with the COVID outbreak, the NAE initiated a grand challenge call to action. Again, this was all sort of derivatives of this original grand challenge is for engineering. And the call to action really is letting engineering, engineers, students, academia, industry, people come up with solutions that can be used for various aspects of addressing the COVID-19, whether it be, you know, how do you make some of the personal protective equipment faster? How do you make, what do you do about vaccines? It's the programs and the people, and you get involved in things that hopefully make a difference. One thing that I would really want to, you know, emphasize is to really thank all the members who have contributed to the NAE fund every year. And it's very important, no matter what you give, for a good participation rate. And then to thank my fellow Einstein members and loyalty members for the, you know, the continued contributions and also the generous contributions that people have made so that the NAE can move forward on its mission.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for the second part of our plenary and forum session on engineering for pandemics, preparedness, response, and recovery. My name is Al Romig, the Executive Officer of the National Academy of Engineering, and I want to start by thanking the program committee that helped us assemble this wonderful program that we've enjoyed yesterday and today. And now I am pleased to be able to introduce Deanne Bell, who will serve as our forum moderator. Deanne is an engineer, television host, and entrepreneur. Her TV hosting credits include PBS, ESPN, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, DIY Network, and most recently, CNBC's Make Me a Millionaire Inventor. She is also the founder and CEO of Future Engineers, an education technology company that engages students on online contests and challenges. Previously, she worked at Raytheon for 3 years as an optomechanical engineer. She earned her BS in mechanical engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, and her full bio is available in your program. So now, let's everyone welcome Deanne.
Hello, everyone. Hello, members of the Academy. Hello to the general public. Thank you so much for joining us here this year for this incredible forum that Al has put together. So thanks for the warm introduction, Al. Some of you might remember me from last year. I had the honor of moderating the panel last year about space exploration and the 50th anniversary of Apollo. This year we have a different theme for the forum, but one that is very near and dear to all of us, whether it's professionally or personally. Today, our forum is going to be about engineering for pandemics, preparedness, response, and recovery. And we have 6 fantastic experts here today to speak both about addressing this current pandemic, but also lessons learned for thinking about how to prepare for future pandemics. I know that I can speak personally for the fact that I never dreamt that I would actually be living through a pandemic. I remember the first time going to the grocery store when COVID-19 happened, and the shelves were depleted. I didn't want to make eye contact with anyone. I questioned the safety and security of my own mask. There were so many unknowns. It was new, it was real, it was scary. And now as we're here, I think it's not new anymore. And there's been so much engineering and scientific discovery. We are in the thick of it. And I'm excited to hear from our speakers today to get their expertise on where we are currently and lessons we've learned and how to prepare for future pandemics. So I am going to briefly introduce all 6 of our panelists, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it's going to go. I'm just going to introduce them briefly so we know who's on our panel, and then each of them are going to have about 8 minutes to speak to you about their expertise. So first, we're going to start by introducing Pam Chang. So Pam, if you want to give a wave. Pam is Executive Vice President of Global Operations and Information Technology at AstraZeneca, a pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical company, which many of you might know is in phase 3 trials for a candidate COVID-19 vaccine. And today she's going to continue on her thoughts on the plenary yesterday about fighting COVID-19 with resilience, a race against time. Next, we will have Dr. David Walt. He is the Hans-Jörg Weiss Professor of Bioinspired Engineering at Harvard Medical School. He shared his expertise yesterday at the plenary about COVID-19, from devices to diagnostics to therapeutics to data analytics. And he also serves on the National Academy's Standing Committee for Emerging Infectious Diseases and 20th Century Health Threats. And he'll be sharing some insights from his role on that committee today, in addition to following up on his thoughts yesterday with the plenary. We have speaking today Dr. Sabina Alkire. She directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and she's Associate Professor of Development Studies at the University of Oxford. And Sabina is going to speak to pandemics and poverty. And fun fact, Sabina is actually calling in from Bhutan. We've got people from all over the globe calling in today. And next we have Dr. Dan Work. Dan is an associate professor at Vanderbilt University in the departments of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and the Institute for Software Integrated Systems. He's a recognized transportation expert, and he's going to be speaking about keeping society's systems operational, so including the impacts of pandemic on mobility and supply chain. Next we have Dr. Paul McKenzie. He is Chief Operating Officer at CSL Limited. And CSL Limited is a global biotechnology company with a portfolio of life-saving medicines as well as vaccines to prevent influenza. And he will be speaking to rapid engineering of critical supplies and the role of advanced manufacturing. And another fun fact about Paul is that Paul was a grad student of John Anderson, NAE president. And then our 6th member of the panel, I believe Bill is here. Is that correct? Bill, can you say hi if you're here?
Hi, I'm here.
He is here, yay! Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. So wonderful. So our 6th panelist is Dr. Bill Rouse. Bill is a researcher, educator, author, and entrepreneur. And he's currently a research professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and principal at Curtis Mediter, a company focused on the health of people, processes, and organizations in society. And he's going to be speaking about the implications for the future of work. So as you can see, we are covering all sectors of pandemic preparedness, response, and recovery. And to kick us off today with our little mini sessions, we're going to start with Pam. And before we do that, I want to let everyone know that we're going to have the speakers each give an 8-minute segment sharing their expertise. And that at the end of all of these, we are going to be taking questions from the audience. So go ahead and send in your questions as they pop into your head. And we have someone that's filtering those questions so that we can then do a healthy, extensive Q&A at the end of this and get all of your questions answered. So without further ado, we are going to start with Pam. So Pam, we have you on screen here. So here we go. So I should also let everyone know that I'm going to be giving an abridged version of everyone's bios, but if you go to the NAE website, for the version of the bio is there for your reference. So Pam Chang joined AstraZeneca in 2015 as Executive Vice President of Global Operations and Information Technology. AstraZeneca is a pharmaceutical company which is in phase 3 trials for a candidate COVID-19 vaccine. At AstraZeneca, Pam leads a team of over 19,000 and guides the company's manufacturing, supply chain, procurement, and IT across 18 countries. Before AstraZeneca, she spent 18 years in global manufacturing, supply chain, and commercial roles at Merck MSD. As a president of MSD China, she was responsible for MSD's entire business in China, sales and marketing, commercial operations, and oversight of manufacturing and research and development. Prior to that, she was head of global supply chain management and logistics for Merck and led the transformation of Merck supply chains across the global supply network. Ms. Chang holds bachelor's and master's degrees in chemical engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology and an MBA in marketing from Pace University. So Pam, go ahead and give us your presentation.
Thank you very much, Deanne. I am like so happy. You actually speak faster than me. So this is awesome. Although I'm going to try to slow down today. So hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to participate again today. You know, I understand that not all of you have seen the presentation by David and myself yesterday. So I repeat some of the key messages here. I mean, I think it's safe to say that we are living in such a different world than 7 months ago, right? As of this morning, I checked the WHO website, 35 million people have been infected, 35. We've passed the 35 million mark, and over 1 million people have died from it. So nothing we have seen in our lives. So we all recognize that this global pandemic has gone beyond just being a health crisis. It is now showing signs of an impending economic crisis and recession. And no parts of this world has been left untouched, right? This virus does not respect borders, it doesn't discriminate, and it can only be defeated with a global response involving more than one company, more than one institution, more than one government. It takes all of us. We at AstraZeneca are doing our part. We have hundreds of colleagues, myself included actually, working literally 24/7 on COVID-19 programs. We've got a potential vaccine, which I will do a deep dive on, monoclonal antibodies, and treatment options of existing medicines. Next slide, please. So now I would like to focus on the vaccine program, what we call the AZD1222. This vaccine is based on an existing recombinant adenovirus vector. It's actually through a partnership with Oxford University. It avoids issues with pre-existing immunity to human adenoviruses and is not non-replicating in human bodies due to gene deletions. And it contains generic materials of the virus spike protein. Phase 1/2 interim data has been very encouraging. Our phase 2/3 trials are now ongoing in multiple countries. 4 key things is worthy of noting from the phase 1/2 interim data. We've seen robust immune response against the virus with both rapid antibody and T cell responses. So that's really good. We see neutralizing activities in 91% of the participants 1 month after vaccination, and in 100% of the participants who receive a second dose. We are still now in clinical trials, so it's possible this becomes a 2-dose vaccine. So the neutralizing antibody is an antibody that actually defends a cell from an infectious particle by neutralizing any effects it has on a human body. T cell response was induced in 100% of the participants, peaking by day 14 and maintained 2 months after injection. And then lastly, AZD1222 was well tolerated with transient, local, and systemic reactions comparable to previous trials and other adenoviral vector vaccines. So these are 4 key points we've noted in phase 1/2 interim data, and hence why we've progressed into phase 2/3 trials in multiple countries as we speak. In the meantime, we have been working very hard in the manufacturing and supply spaces. As you can see here, it's a rather typical biologic manufacturing process where you start with fermentation, followed by infection, harvest, purification, and then yielding the drug substance, which then is formulated and filled into a, in this case, during the pandemic, a 10-dose vial, and then packaged and delivered. So as you know, many of you will know, development and manufacturing of vaccine usually takes years to do. You're going to hear from You heard from David yesterday. You're going to hear from many of the panelists, and Paul in particular, and talking about manufacturing today. It takes a matter of years to develop and manufacture a vaccine. So we are now trying to accelerate this into a matter of a few months or a year. So how are we doing that? You know, there are many questions around, are we taking shortcuts? You know, all these vaccines going to be safe? So I want to kind of address that a little bit today. I mean, one of the major ways to accomplish a shorter timeline is the fact that we are investing in manufacturing at risk. Typically, we normally would not, because the capital investments and are pretty significant associated with vaccine manufacturing. And normally companies would wait until positive trial data to invest in manufacturing. But in this case, AstraZeneca and many of the companies, all of the companies who are working on COVID-19 programs are investing in manufacturing at the same time as we are triggering on clinical trials. This speaks to the criticality of actually our engineers, who are now not only working on developing the process, but at the same time improving the process in rapid speed. So our goal here is actually to have the vaccine available and not lose a single day in bringing this vaccine to the world, should this vaccine works. So on a day of approval or emergency usage authority, we would absolutely want to ensure that on that day, we're making these vaccines available to the global population. So I want to kind of raise that point and kind of debunk a bit of the myth out there that there must be shortcuts in the effort to accelerate these vaccines. And the answer is absolutely not. We are following all of the necessary safety protocols and measures to ensure safety and efficacy. Next slide, please. So as a global citizen, I mean, we sincerely hope multiple of these vaccines in the works will work. It's going to take more than one company and one vaccine to truly make a difference here. We are continuing our efforts to produce vaccine at a larger scale. From the very beginning, AstraZeneca has said it will provide broad and equitable supply of the vaccine around the world at no profit during the pandemic. We remain true to that today, and will continue to work with the government and other organizations around the world to ensure a fair and equitable supply. So today, my team has literally worked 24/7 over, my light goes out here, sustainability at work. My entire team has been working 24/7 with global partners, and we've actually now working with over 20 partners in standing up parallel supply chains to be able to support over 3 billion doses of this potential vaccine, right? So very significant scale that we've never even talked about before. So very, very impressive set of numbers. And we hope that this vaccine will work. And if it does work, we will be ready to supply this around the world. Next slide, please. And I think, you know, in the spirit of how engineering is really fighting against this pandemic and making a real difference here is, I talked about this yesterday, and I thought it was worthy to kind of mention it again today, where we've got a bunch of engineers at one of our facilities in Westchester, Ohio, that absolutely are doing wonders. I've been in the industry for a long, long time, and I've never seen being able to construct this in you know, going from concept to construction in 10 weeks, qualification start in 21 weeks, if you will. And this is to create a formulation and filling and packaging facility for this COVID-19 vaccine. We had to take a solid powder filling facility and convert it into a biosafety containment facility. And for those of you in the industry, know that this is not a small task. So we are literally being able to do this effort in 3 or 4 months instead of what we would normally take around 18 months. So significant efforts here. We've modified and repurposed over 17,000 square feet of manufacturing space. And we created 33 rooms, classified in clean rooms, and miles of piping and cabling and ductwork. So absolutely amazing work. Just an example what passionate and smart engineers can do at a time like this. So in closing, next slide, I just want to, I can't say enough about innovation and speed at this point in time. We don't know a lot of things at this moment, but one thing we do know is that life will be very different after the pandemic, and innovation and resilience will be absolutely key moving forward. Thanks again for the opportunity to join all of you today. Back to you, Deanna.
Thank you, Pam. I think I can speak on behalf of all engineers in the audience that the prospect of manufacturing 3 billion doses, I think, is an engineering challenge and feat of epic proportions. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Next, we're going to go to David Walt. David, do you see me? All right. So next, many of you heard from David yesterday in the plenary, and he gave a lot of wonderful information. I attended and I learned quite a bit as well. I'm going to tee up David Walt to give you a little bit of background about him, and then he's going to continue in that thought and give you some information as well that you mentioned of the committee that you're on. So Dr. David Walt is the Hans-Jörg Weiss Professor of Bio-Inspired Engineering at Harvard Medical School. He's Professor of Pathology at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's a core faculty member of the Weiss Institute at Harvard University. He's a Howard Hughes Medical Institute professor and co-director of the Mass General Brigham Center for COVID Innovation. Dr. Walt's laboratory pioneered the development of microwell arrays, which revolutionized the field of genetic analysis and introduced the idea of digital protein detection by developing a high throughput technology for performing single molecule analysis. His research is aimed at applying new technologies to address unmet clinical diagnostic needs. Dr. Walt has founded or co-founded several life science startups and has received numerous national and international awards. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine, as well as a fellow for multiple academies and organizations. He serves on the National Academy's Standing Committee for Emerging Infectious Diseases and 21st Century Health Threats. He has a BS in chemistry from the University of Michigan and a PhD in chemical biology from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. So David, take it away.
Thank you, Deanne. So first, I'd like to thank everyone who sent such thoughtful notes to me in response to my plenary talk yesterday. I covered a lot, as Deanne mentioned. So instead of trying to summarize my talk from yesterday, I thought I'd briefly take the audience through the activities of the Standing Committee. Next slide, please. So the charge to the committee, although the committee was stood up during a crisis, it's important to recognize that we were charged with providing long-term guidance, not only on the present crisis, COVID-19, but also on other emerging infectious diseases to really plan for not just this pandemic, but the next one and the one after that, and really set things in order so that the next time these kinds of things arise, we're much better prepared. I think we all hope that comes to fruition. We're also tasked to provide advice to both the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, and Health and Human Services on very short notice. The committee's chair, and I decided not to put the whole committee composition and bore you with that, but the committee's chair is Harvey Feinberg, who was formerly the Institute of Medicine, now NAM president, but he was formerly the iOS president, and he's been doing a marvelous job chairing the committee. There originally were 15 members on the committee, and the membership has grown. I think there's now approximately 25 of us, as we've added experts in areas that were not represented when the initial committee was formed. And we found these experts were needed to address different issues as they arose as the pandemic evolved. Next slide, please. Next slide. Great. So the committee was formed in February, and I think it's important to state that I'm not sure if there's been any committee in the long history of the National Academies that was formed, went to work, issued reports on so many topics in such a short time frame. You can see that the first meeting after we were stood up was in March, and then we were immediately tasked with multiple rapid consultations that we'll see on the next slide. So next slide, please. So this really just gives you, this is a list of the rapid expert consultations, and these were completed between sometime in, say, around the second week of March through the first week in May. We performed 12 what are called rapid expert consultations. And for those of you who have served on NRC, National Academy committees previously, you know that these things often take quite a long time because there are findings and recommendations. They have to go through peer review. They then have to come back to the authors, that is the committee, to get revised, and then they get monitored and revised again. And this iterative process takes a while. These consultations were done a very different way. OSTP or HHS asked us a question. They said, can you tell us why is it, for example, when the pandemic hit Italy, all of a sudden they were beginning to see many more children showing up in hospitals, and they said, is this, is the virus mutating and is now a threat to young people? And it turned out it wasn't. It was just that there were more cases being reported in Italy, just because there were just more cases in Italy than had appeared in any other part of the world up to that point. So we performed 12 rapid expert consultations in a very short period of time. Each of these, sometimes we'd get a call, say at 10 o'clock at night, we'd get started, and either the next day or the day after that, we would have our expert consultation ready. We would send it out for peer review. And so these were peer reviewed. So we had some incredibly responsive reviewers who, probably woke up in the middle of the night, reviewed these things and got them back to the committee. We provide expert consultations on, you can read the topics, but topics such as the stability of the virus on various surfaces. Nobody knew, how persistent were these things. Social distancing, the formation of aerosols as people breathed and how far they were transmitted, the effectiveness of fabric masks, and as you can see, many other topics that just kept coming one after the other as the pandemic began to evolve in the US. We were in constant communication with OSTP staff, and while attribution isn't clear, on April 3rd, the day after we submitted our report on aerosol formation, the president recommended wearing non-medical face coverings to the American public. So, we don't know, if there's a direct line drawn between committee's work and what the president said, but, we were really in touch with, OSTP at the White House, who were in direct contact with the president and his staff. Next slide. So in addition to these rapid consultations, we have issued 2 consensus reports on data infrastructure and also on school reopening. These are more in line with sort of your traditional kind of academy reports, although again, they were done on a much more rapid sort of time frame. Next slide. One of the things that I think came up both during my talk yesterday and also during some of the other comments that were made yesterday is the pandemic has really underscored the importance of both the social and behavioral sciences. And, we as engineers, as scientists think that, technology sometimes is the full solution, but I think this pandemic has really underscore the importance of behavior and social policies, and to coordinate these areas with our committee. We have very strong collaboration with something called the Societal Experts Action Network, SEAN, and we continue to coordinate with them because many of the implementation ideas that are coming out really require very close communication with those areas of science. Next slide, please. So, next slide. So finally, we are continuing to work on other projects. We do occasionally get a call for a quick consultation, but more of the committee's efforts are beginning to look to both the medium and long range roadmaps. So we're in the process of developing our diagnostics roadmap, a report on healthcare worker morbidity and mortality. That is, how did people in the healthcare industry get infected? What ways can we do to avoid? What things can we do to avoid exposing them and having them get both sick and having their diseases progress, and also the impact of globalization on future health crises. All these materials, I think there's one more slide, are available through the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering Medicine website, so you can read all the reports and other materials on the website. You can see the committee composition, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the standing committee, but also anything that I brought up yesterday during my plenary. So I'll return it back to you, Deanne.
Thank you, David. And thank you for ramping up. It's crazy to think about how fast all of this has to happen, right? Innovation at speed. We're in a race for sure. Next, we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about rapid manufacturing and talking about how to quickly ramp up responses to the pandemic. So next, we're going to go to Paul McKenzie. Paul, do I see you there? Yep. So Paul McKenzie is a Chief Operating Officer at CSL Limited, a global biotechnology company with a portfolio of life-saving medicines, including those that treat hemophilia and immune deficiencies, as well as vaccines to prevent influenza. He leads the company's global end-to-end operations organization and its accompanying strategy for achieving safety, quality, reliability, and innovation. He has responsibility for CSL Plasma and its network of more than 260 collection centers in the US and Europe, as well as many other roles in the company, including manufacturing, quality, and engineering. In July, he took on additional responsibilities, including Seqirus, one of the world's largest influenza vaccine providers, and a partner in pandemic preparedness. Prior to joining CSL, Dr. McKenzie was Executive Vice President of Pharmaceutical Operations and Technology at Biogen. He also has held senior roles in R&D and manufacturing for Johnson & Johnson, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Merck. Dr. McKenzie was elected to the NAE earlier this year and is a fellow member. He has served on numerous professional and academic boards, and he holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, both in chemical engineering. So Paul, go ahead and take it away with your slides.
Great, Diane. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here with you and this distinguished panel today to share some thoughts and learnings about the important role that engineering has in addressing pandemics, especially when it comes to scaling up vaccine production. A few fun facts about CSL. Pandemic preparedness and response has been part of our DNA for over 100 years. CSL was established in 1916 as Australia wanted to prepare for the potential impacts of World War I and having a concern about not having access to vaccines and therapeutic products. So we're one of the few companies that have been involved in all the pandemics. We made a vaccine for the Spanish influenza pandemic in 1918, and we've also made vaccines for the swine flu pandemic in 2009, and are working hard and are very proud of all our colleagues around the globe who are working on multiple COVID-19 vaccines, in some case working with our partners and helping out AstraZeneca as a CMO. It's contract manufacturer, or with the University of Queensland, we're developing from initial science our own COVID-19. In addition, we're doing a significant amount of work in hyperimmune work where we isolate antibodies from plasma, and we're on call in case the US government would need larger quantities of convalescent plasma to move forward to fight this tremendous challenge that we're experiencing across the globe. So before I dig into what we actually do for the pandemic, I thought it would be good, next slide please, to really just talk about how vaccines are produced. I won't go through all the details here, but I thought many of the people on the call may not be aware of how a vaccine is actually produced. The diagram I show here, in the case of influenza seasonal vaccine, shows how we start from the initial identification of the strains that are going to be relevant in the seasonal year from WHO through the production and final assembly of 4 monovalent antigens and an associated adjuvant that then make up the vaccine that we use to dose us. This year, we will supply over 60 million doses to the Northern Hemisphere for influenza. It's important to note the success of the ability to deliver 60 million doses is really built on an advanced manufacturing platform. We've been investing in this cell technology platform since 2012. It's critically important to note that was made possible by a public-private partnership with the US government. And as David had shared yesterday, there's quite a few examples where advanced manufacturing platforms and advanced manufacturing engineering and science have really come to life as we've tried to balance and fight this pandemic. It's really important that advanced manufacturing be invested in, and be invested in years before we actually have to use that muscle, not only for our day-to-day production or development activities, but as well for pandemic response. The combination of the platform and the underlying business processes serves then as a springboard for our ability to fight in a pandemic situation. What we're able to do is select an optimal strain with the proven platform. If we had pre-work in surveillance and seed development, we're able to really have an opportunity to accelerate the response. If the seed has been selected for preemptive development, production can be almost started immediately. Preparing the seed and bulk antigen is critically important, and we need to make sure that it aligns with the pandemic virus strain. And then the simple part, we just produce large and many doses across the globe. It's important to note, though, that seasonal vaccines and pandemic vaccines, as Pam highlighted, are very different in terms of their requirements. A seasonal vaccine may only require 60 million doses, as I said, but as you saw from Pam's slide, we're talking hundreds of millions of doses, if not billions of doses, moving forward. Next slide, please. So how does rapid engineering of critical supplies and advanced manufacturing really contribute, not only in the vaccine industry or in the therapeutic industry, but in all the industries that David had highlighted in his talk yesterday and today? Advanced manufacturing has a critical role in the rapid engineering of supplies, whether it's PPE and face masks or vaccines. Pandemics, of course, are unpredictable. Advanced manufacturing is essential to provide the technical platform and defense against these public health threats, and must, as I said earlier, be invested in a timing well before the pandemic event. What is included in advanced manufacturing? Advanced manufacturing can be just utilizing new or novel technologies, things that people haven't thought of before. Established processes like a platform that already exists, but using it in different ways. Using an established platform to make new products, if you think about what Ford and Boeing and other companies were able to do in converting their platforms and facilities to be able to make products, distilleries that were able to shift over from making distilled products to hand sanitizer. And really, these advanced manufacturings allow, most importantly, advanced and rapid scale up. It's that scale up that's so critical for us to be able to respond to a pandemic event. Advanced manufacturing has been critical for our ability to be able to respond to COVID-19. Without our capabilities that were developed, like I said, in a public-private partnership, both with the US government and the University of Queensland and Australian governments, we would not have been prepared to proceed and rapidly scale up multiple COVID vaccine opportunities that we now currently have in clinical trials. Next slide, please. So when you think about the 4 pillars of pandemic response, and our future panel speakers will speak about many of these things, you have people, processes, facilities, and distribution. All 4 of these need to be well tuned to be able to respond to a pandemic. From a people viewpoint, it's number 1 is always ensuring safety of the personnel, particularly as they're doing something new and innovative, something different from their standard course of manufacturing. They also have to build in flexibility and contingency. How do you repurpose people around the globe to really center and focus on this new effort while you keep your ongoing production in progress? Process. As I shared with the advanced manufacturing, how do we make sure our product and processes we really need to understand them. It's essential. It is what allows expedited product development. It's how we take advantage of our ability to rapidly scale up. And as Pam highlighted, facilities. We need to understand our facilities inside and out, but we also need to be able to leverage others' facilities. So having a very leveraged, collaborative environment across multiple industries is critical for our response in a pandemic. We're actually all learning how to collaborate with government agencies, with other industries in ways that we never thought of. Something we probably need to improve as we prepare, and as David mentioned yesterday, for future pandemics that will come. And then finally, distribution and supply chain in a pandemic becomes even more insurmountable. It takes different views of how you will approach regulatory agencies, how you'll handle the cold chain, how you'll actually be able to get product from point of view to point of use from the factory in record time. These are all challenges and pillars of a pandemic that require different thinking from your normal manufacturing to be successful. Next slide, please. So if you think about what's gone on in the pharmaceutical manufacturing response for COVID-19, and you really look at what we've been able to do and what we've been able to not do, right? We've acknowledged that product development is short. As Pam said, it's much shorter than a typical vaccine development exercise, but we have no choice other than to proceed. We've done many things with process and product development at risk, and we've had to work collectively with every group across the drug development and commercialization paradigm. If you think about it, every group is being challenged, whether it's the manufacturing and development groups, whether it's the clinical groups, whether it's the safety groups, the basic research groups, the commercialization groups. All of us have had to rethink how we do day-to-day work to make sure that this pandemic vaccine and future challenges like this are well addressed. I think it's critically important for us to think about how we approach these issues and how we make sure we do a complete lessons learned from raw material to supply and the collaborative industry-wide exercise that we need to be ready to do, not now, but also in the future. And the reality of it is you also have to realize we just don't, one company itself, no matter how big you are, no matter how many thousands of employees you have, your in-house capacity typically in today's world won't be sufficient. And whether that's capacity of running clinical trials or whether that's capacity of doing your safety and science work, but in this particular case, it's relative to capacity in the development and manufacturing space. So having a strong ecosystem of partners that can work with you, that understand how you do business is critically important. And some of the technology Pam highlighted yesterday in terms of augmented reality, virtual reality, will really drive our ability to do that much better in the future. In conclusion,
I'm giving you a kind moderator note that we need to wrap it up soon.
well, it's good. I already have one more sentence. So in conclusion, the effectiveness of our global response to COVID-19 depends on engineers, medical professionals, scientists across industry, nonprofits, and government to tackle new challenges and to work together in new and collaborative ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the number one takeaway I got from that was collaboration. And I think that's something that a lot of people are interested to hear about is how do we collaborate together in this global response. Next, we are going to talk about a different subject really related to mobility and transport and global supply chain. So next we're going to have Dr. Dan Work. Dan, I think you're on there. So Dr. Dan Work is an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering, electrical engineering and computer science, and the Institute for Software Integrated Systems at Vanderbilt University. He has held research appointments at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics, Microsoft Research Redmond, and Nokia Research Center Palo Alto. Dan pioneered methods for monitoring and controlling road traffic using vehicles to sense and control road congestion. In 2015, his team was the first to experimentally demonstrate that phantom traffic jams can be eliminated via control of a small fraction of automated vehicles in the flow. As a researcher at Nokia, he designed the first GPS smartphone-based traffic estimation algorithm. He is a recognized transportation expert, a 2018 recipient of the Gilbreth Lectureship from the National Academy of Engineering, and a 2014 Career Award winner from the National Science Foundation. He earned a BS from Ohio State and his master's and PhD from UC Berkeley, all in civil and environmental engineering. So go ahead, Dan, take it away.
Well, thanks, Deanne. I'd like to talk to you today about our transportation systems because they're so important to keeping the rest of society's systems operational. At the end of the day, transportation systems are responsible for moving goods and moving people. And in the context of a pandemic, that really means moving essential supplies as well as essential workers. And so in my remarks today, I'd like to focus on some of the challenges we face in the short, medium, and long term as we try to keep these transportation systems serving society. First slide, please. Well, as the slide comes up, let me just start at the very high level with remarking that transportation systems have gone under a pretty major disruption due to COVID-19, with the most dramatic impacts being on the high density modes. In particular, our high density modes such as air travel, public transportation, and rideshare services have had ridership numbers that have fallen between 60 and 70% compared to their expected ridership numbers last year. The impacts are dramatic and important because those drops in ridership are ultimately impacting the ability to raise revenue to continue to operate those services. On the other hand, if we look at long-haul truck traffic, which is important because somewhere between about 63% of the economic value of freight in the United States is moved by truck, the impacts on trucks have not been nearly as extreme, with those numbers down somewhere between 10 and 5%. What's important between high-density modes such as air travel and other modes such as freight on trucks is that the operators of these modes are still people. And if those operators get sick, we put at risk the ability to effectively move our people and our goods efficiently. In the medium term, one of the things that's going to be important to monitor is the rates of recovery of our transportation systems. And in particular, if we see a discrepancy between the rate at which people are using higher density modes such as public transit and lower density modes such as single occupancy vehicles, we could be setting up a perfect storm. The current estimates of two separate studies that were conducted recently show that the number of people working from home is in the neighborhood of 30 to 45% of commuters that were previously traveling to work. If those commute numbers stay low, that's actually effectively removing vehicles from the roadway and allowing less demand on the roadway. At the same time, if we continue to see in the regrowth of transportation after the pandemic, if we see long-term shifts away from these high-density modes into single occupancy vehicles, and we're not able to maintain these increased rates of work from home, what we will open up the opportunity for is increased congestion on the roadways. This is particularly important because prior to the pandemic, we already lost between $70 and $80 billion of value due to congestion. That's either lost time and lost fuel. And so if we have long-term shifts away from these high density modes into single occupancy vehicles, we're going to be placing an increased load on our road network because we just can't expand the supply of the road network as quickly as the demand might accelerate. So it's going to be really important to pay attention to these numbers because we could be setting ourselves up for a scenario where congestion is overall worse, which will ultimately impact our ability to effectively move these goods and supplies. In the long term, what I'd like to do is focus on the big challenges that we were facing in our transportation systems prior to the pandemic, which was generally centered around the three revolutions that were simultaneously occurring. These are revolutions that were centered around automating the vehicle fleet, developing shared modes such as ride share, car share, and shared modes such as bikes, and ultimately electrification of the vehicle fleet. The space for automation was generally centered around the fact that we wanted to use technology to reduce the 35,000 plus fatalities that occur on our roadways every year. And we've also been interested in automation as a way to reduce the operating cost. But as I mentioned earlier, removing human drivers from the equation to move essential goods and supplies becomes a possibility of automation in the long term. Now, automation is not here at a scale where it can be meaningful to help in today's pandemic, but it's definitely interesting to see if we might be able to accelerate the rate at which we're automating vehicle fleets to add in resilience for the next pandemic. The case for the shared vehicle systems is a bit more nuanced. If we're able to make those systems safe so that people can use them, and at the same time can communicate that safety to the general public, then those shared modes might have a potential future post-pandemic. But this remains an open question, one, if we can make them safe, and two, if we can communicate that safety effectively to the people ultimately making choices. Then the final piece on the electrification, I think, is really more important as we think about the environmental impacts of our transportation systems. Given the current volatility of our both ability to move people and freight, if we're seeing increased congestion, increased first mile or last mile delivery, it's going to be very important to continue to target reducing the environmental footprint of our transportation, and vehicle electrification offers one opportunity to do so. So with that, I'll end my remarks and look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. All really, really insightful information. And we've got questions coming in for you too, but we'll wait and do that after our final two speakers. So next we're going to transition to Dr. Sabina Alkire. Sabina, are you there? Yet again, I said she's calling from Bhutan, and we had some electricity issues, but I think you're here loud and clear. We're excited to have you, Sabina. So Dr. Sabina Alkire directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Developmental Initiative, OPI, and is Associate Professor of Development Studies at the University of Oxford. She co-developed the Alkire-Foster method, which has been implemented empirically to produce the Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, a tool to identify who is poor by considering the range of deprivations they suffer. The MPI is a headline figure of poverty that shows how people are poor nationally, as well as by areas and groups and by each indicator. In 2015 and 2016, Dr. Alkire was the Oliver T. Carr Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Economics at George Washington University. Previously, she worked at the Global Equity Initiative at Harvard University, the UN Commission on Human Security, and the World Bank's Poverty and Culture Learning and Research Initiative. She holds a master's and doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford. Sabina, you have the stage.
Thank you so much. So this presentation shifts gear and it turns from product development and rollout to product destination. So we work on multidimensional poverty, and to do so we assess the joint distribution of deprivations that strike the same person at the same time. And we do so because studies show it's more effective to fight poverty in an integrated way, not going at deprivations one by one. And since March, we've, of course, worked alongside governments in COVID emergency response. So my hope is to introduce you to the metrics of multidimensional poverty, and also to invoke your suggestions of how better to address the topic, pandemics and poverty. Next slide. With the United Nations Development Programme, our research center, OPHI, at the University of Oxford, has computed a comparable measure of acute multidimensional poverty since 2010. And this year we cover 107 developing countries, home to 5.9 billion people. The global MPI, as it's called, covers 3 equally weighted dimensions and 10 indicators equally weighted within their respective dimension. You're deprived in nutrition if anyone in your household is undernourished, in child mortality if sadly any child has perished in the last 5 years, in years of schooling if nobody has finished 6th grade in your house, and school attendance if any child is not attending school up through 8th grade. You are deprived if you do not have clean cooking fuel, adequate sanitation, safe drinking water, electricity, and sturdy housing. And you're deprived in the assets indicator if you don't own more than one of these: a radio, television, telephone, computer, animal cart, bicycle, motorcycle, car, or refrigerator. Now, any person who's deprived in at least 1/3 of the weighted indicators is identified as poor. The data are presented with confidence intervals disaggregated by age and subnational regions, broken down by indicator. And robustness tests display the sensitivity of results to a range of plausible parameters. Next slide. But what are those results? Before the pandemic, of the 5.9 billion people, next slide, 1.3 billion, or 22%, were multidimensionally poor. Half of these are children. 2/3 live in middle, not low income countries. 84% in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, roughly equal in each. And when we say multidimensional, we mean multidimensional. Of the 1.3 billion people, 99% carry at least 3 dimensions and 82% at least 5 deprivations. Now, this has been changing, and OFI traced trends for 75 countries and 5 billion people. And in 65 countries, MPI was statistically significantly reduced in the previous period. For example, between 2005-06 and 15-16, over 270 million people left poverty in India. And the poorest groups in India, children, Muslims, scheduled caste and tribes, and the poorest states, reduced poverty the fastest. So not only was the magnitude of India's reduction great, its distribution was equalizing. The poorest were not being left behind, but they were catching up. So this is the global MPI. And if we had more time, we would break the results down by ethnicity and race or disability, or go within the household to look at gender inequalities and intra-household disparities, or see how reduction in each indicator drove change. Next slide. Enter COVID-19. For many, the pandemic has affected our mobility, health, mental well-being, and livelihoods. But for the poor, COVID-19 is one more burden that they now carry, in addition to the deprivation load they already bore. And the poverty-derived comorbidities make the course of the virus more deadly. For example, people who are undernourished or drink dirty water may have a depressed immune response. Those who cook with wood, dung, or charcoal may be more prone to acute respiratory infections. And across the 5.9 billion people, 3.6 billion face at least one of those deprivations, and 435 million have all 3 at the same time. So COVID strikes them differently. Not to mention if they lost their jobs, have no place to wash their hands, or live in overcrowded or violent surrounds. And COVID also affects poverty trends themselves. When we simulated scenarios based on the UN predicted increases in food security and out-of-school children, we found that the COVID probably set the global trends back by 3 to 10 years. But these figures are not really a prediction as much as a call for action. Next slide. What does this mean for engineers? That's a question you are far better placed to answer than I. Next slide. But one issue is data. Big data, machine learning, AI, they're driving breakthroughs. But when it comes to tackling poverty, such techniques cannot yet predict what we find on the ground. Satellites and cell phone towers don't spot malnourished children. And so we need data to track the actual deprivation bundles poor people face. And yet the pandemic interrupted data collection. Telephone surveys are scaling up massively, but the poorest may not be literate, may not have electricity to charge their phone, or be off the grid. And so there's a need for new strategies to collect data for poverty during the pandemic. For example, in Costa Rica, the CEO of the biggest bank went to the slum and was a bit shocked. Poverty feels different face to face. So he developed an online platform for interviewing staff with ethical and privacy protocols, and was shocked to find that 12% of employees were poor by their national MPI. And this led to a surge of solidarity and creativity to redress the challenges one's own colleagues confront. And as the work scaled up, we spun out the first social enterprise of the university, Sophia Oxford. But there's so much to learn about this intersection. And finally, it sounds very rudimentary or even impolite in a setting of sophisticated, cutting-edge engineering feats to raise the crudeness of people who lack food and water, electricity, schools, or who live on a dirt floor with a bamboo roof that leaks. And yet millions still do. So a question is whether the pandemic and the economic recession can jumpstart not only research on the vaccine, as vital as that is, but also a space where engineers could create a true inflection point in poverty by untangling interlinked deprivation bundles that deeply afflict billions of our companions on the planet. I look forward to our interactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabina. I think so many of your comments were quite impactful and resonate quite a bit with me. I'm curious to see, I know Bill, who's our next speaker, you do a lot of work in understanding and managing complex systems, complex global systems and societies. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well on the pandemic and how it affects the future of work. So we're going to introduce Bill Rouse next. Bill Rouse is a research professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy and senior fellow in the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research, both at Georgetown University. He's Professor Emeritus and former chair of the School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech and principal at Curtis Mediter, a firm focused on the health of people, processes, organizations, and society. His research focuses on understanding and managing complex public-private systems such as healthcare delivery, higher education, transportation, and national security, with emphasis on mathematical and computational modeling of these systems for the purpose of policy design and analysis. Dr. Rouse has written numerous articles and books. He serves on multiple highly esteemed advisory boards, and he has been designated a lifetime National Associate of the National Research Council and National Academies. Dr. Rouse is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and is a fellow of several professional societies and or councils, including IEEE. He received his BS in mechanical engineering from the University of Rhode Island and went on to get his master's and PhD, both in systems engineering from MIT. Bill, it's your turn for slides.
That would help. Non-mute. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you now.
Okay, good. One of the consequences of the pandemic has been a dramatic decrease in employment. And people are really concerned about whether those jobs that they lost are coming back. But this was that's not a new concern. Actually, in recent years, there's been this huge debate about whether automation and AI is going to eliminate huge numbers of jobs. The projections over the next 15 years range from 3 million jobs lost to 80 million jobs lost, which is half of the jobs in the US. I'm mainly focused on the US in the data here. And so being in various meetings that were sort of gloom and doom about the end of work, I ended up thinking about, well, what new jobs are going to be created? And you'll see, I've got, so far I got 23 million in my total. But the big message here is not how many new jobs there are, even though I'm going to address that. It's how are people going to be prepared to take those jobs and perform? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So here's my 23 million new jobs. I'll start at the top. Bureau of Labor Statistics has the fastest growing jobs in the country. So a solar panel installer and wind turbine repair person are among the top 10. Of the top 10, 4 are in technology and 6 are in healthcare. And many of them do not require a college degree. And I'll come back to that in a minute. If you look at the Bridges issue on climate change, it was pretty easy to start to see where jobs are going to be created in the ways in which we mitigate climate change, mitigate sea level rise. Dennis McBride and I have paid quite a bit of attention looking at driverless vehicles. Interestingly, that's going to create a lot of new jobs because I hadn't thought about this in advance, but driverless cars need maintenance every day because you have to make sure their sensors are clean and calibrated and everything. Otherwise, the car doesn't know where it is. And that sounds pretty dangerous to me. And then, so the maintenance is amount of jobs. And then supervision of AI cognitive aids. Basically, if we're going to give the 100 million disabled older adults in the US cognitive aids, cognitive assistive technology, there's going to have to be humans in there someplace that both understand the technology and understand elderly and disabled people, which is quite an interesting mix of competencies. I also looked at what if we renewed the US infrastructure, made it all high tech. What if we gave everyone with chronic illness an access to health coach? What if we tried to achieve 100% high school graduation rate? How many teachers would we need? And so there you see the numbers, and it adds up to 23 million new jobs. Now, interestingly, you might say, well, especially for the last 3, the infrastructure, the chronic illness, and the teachers, where on earth will we get the money to pay for all this? My analysis of this whole set of jobs is that the federal government will make money on this process because they'll be spending less money in categories where they already spend a lot of money. So there's not a question of money, it's really a question of will. Do we have the will to try to pursue these ends? And let's look at the implications. The next slide, please. Okay, most of these jobs will require significant technical skills, but not necessarily a bachelor's degree. So the question is, where are we going to get, how are we going to get people who actually have those technical skills? It's not going to be the kind of thing that someone can just walk in with no training whatsoever and do the jobs. These aren't those kind of jobs. And they'll require significant people skills. For example, to assist disabled and older adults. Okay. These skills could be gained at community colleges and augmented with employer-based training. And I know in several areas where this is happening already. But the interesting thing is the enrollment in the US community college is roughly 10 million. If we're going to add another 23 million students, we're going to have to triple the capacity of the community colleges. But let's think about the implications of that. If we do that, first of all, that isn't anywhere near as expensive as sending your children to Harvard or MIT, okay? Community colleges are very economical and they're very skill and knowledge oriented for employment. We could end up with all these 23 million jobs ends up with people in the middle class making a living wage or a good wage, paying taxes, paying Social Security, okay? That's how we get to the point where we basically are making money by actually taking care and making sure people are healthy, educated, and productive. These are not costs, they're investments. And now is a good time to think about this because the pandemic has forced us to rethink many things. Certainly in higher education, going online changes the whole equation. If you're going to have just your education be online, why not have everybody take physics from Richard Feynman or economics from Paul Samuelson? Okay, that would change enormously the 4 million jobs that exist in higher education right now. But the point is, the technology trends bring with them not only concerns about which jobs will disappear, but I think also the excitement of which jobs will be created. And then the need, and this is my bottom line message here, we have to prepare people so they can perform those jobs. Just being a blue collar worker with not a high school education, no technical skills, you're not going to suddenly do these jobs. And so I think it's time for the country to invest. And as I said, if you look at the economics, the return on investment is substantial and actually relatively quick. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for those thoughts. Okay, so now we are going to transition to Q&A. And I know some people have been sending in their questions throughout these different presentations, but go ahead and start sending your questions in, or we're going to be taking them. I'm actually, because of the interest in time, going to go straight to the audience questions. And we have one that came in recently, which I think is good to kick it off. We talked a lot about the engineering challenges of developing a vaccine and rapidly developing this vaccine. Can we talk a little bit about the distribution of getting that vaccine out there? And as these vaccines become available, where do they go first? And how does that get managed? And yeah, go ahead.
Pam or I could weigh in. Look, I think a couple of things. One, each company has their own commitments that they've made to local governments. So some will be distributed specifically to governments, and then the governments will handle the distribution. There's also Gavi and CEPI, Gavi in particular, that is a global alliance around vaccines. Many of the doses, and you saw on Pam's chart, were slated to that part of the nonprofit part of the world. So they will then work on distribution from their end. And then there's the typical distribution model that we would use through, a retail chain or Veterans Administration type hospital that would line up with your typical vaccines that you distribute as part of your day-to-day. So there's lots of possible avenues in the pandemic response to distribution. And I think Pam's slide kind of gives you all flavors of that, and she may want to comment further.
Yeah, so if I can, thank you, Paul. Let me build on what Paul said. I think there's two aspects of the question. One is the more complicated bit, which is the prioritization. Who gets vaccinated first? You've got billions of people, right? So in the United States, for example, over 300 million of population, who gets it first? Who makes that call? You can't, just the pure logistics, if you will, there needs to be an order. And I think for that part of it, we are working with the governments, we are working with CEPI, for example, and we as a company are not in a position to prioritize for the local government, for example. So we are working with these organizations and the governments to do so. So in the United States, our agreement with the US government is we will ensure these vaccines is available, and then the government will take delivery and they decide who gets it first and how they get it. And I think the second element is almost a simpler bit, but as Paul said, is still significant, which is the physical act of distribution and logistics, right? It's going to take a lot of collaboration across the industries to make that happen. But it's in a way a bit simpler and less complicated than the first bit, as you heard Sabina talk about. Truth to the matter is, fair and equitable access means somebody have to make those calls.
Definitely heard, and I think yet again collaboration across every sector, government, policy. I have a follow-up question to that in terms of more the distribution aspect of it. Someone asked about, this is for you, Pam, or whoever else wants to take it, but I'll start with Pam. The temperature stability of various vaccine candidates for COVID-19 are quite variable, with some requiring -70°C, some -20°C, and some potentially at room temperature. This difference has tremendous implications on global supply chain management to manufacture, store, and deliver, as well as what markets would have access to specific vaccines. Would welcome any comments from the panel about this.
Yeah, so I go first, and I think many of the panelists on will be able to address this as well. It makes a huge difference, right? So if it's a -2 to 8, which is what we call the typical cold chain, I think, you know, many of the flu vaccines go through that route. Many of the other vaccines on the market goes through that route, and the capability and the infrastructure within around the world is quite sound for that. Albeit there are countries that still lacking of those basic infrastructures. But the moment you get into, you know, -40, -60, I mean, when you get into frozen sort of vaccines, and it does become a logistic nightmare, let alone to mention billions of doses, right? So it does matter. But then again, if that's the only game in town, then that's what make it work, right? So I think, you know, and I think this is why it's quite beautiful, if you will, that multiple companies, multiple vaccines are in the works right now. And it may, in the end, maybe a combination of all those becomes the solution for this pandemic. The other element is really around the notion of affordability, albeit that many of the companies, AstraZeneca is not the only company that has gone out and say, we will do this at cost and no profit. But nevertheless, you know, for the underdeveloped countries or developing countries, depending on the vaccine itself, it can still be an affordability issue, right? So a lot to think about here.
Does anyone want to take that question as well? Or does anyone want to chime in on that? Distribution? All right.
Yeah, and I may just add a quick word. Right, so I think at the end of the day, when we're thinking about delivering goods that are essential, we have the ability to prioritize in the freight distribution network those items. So we're currently already doing that with essential supplies. Obviously, the more stringent the requirements are in terms of temperature, that just makes the total available delivery vehicles that can do that a little bit more challenging. But I think if the transportation system is running effectively, it sits in the background and it just works. And so we've got a lot of work to do to make sure those systems are operational and that we can stay meeting the delivery constraints that are needed. But mostly really just need to be paying attention to how stringent those temperature requirements are and what we might have available to do that delivery.
Great, okay. So we're gonna pivot to another question, and I'm gonna address this to David. We have a question here about how will the country keep track of COVID-19 when rapid home testing is available? And I think this speaks to the broader data analytics. I think all of our speakers mentioned data analytics. Obviously, we know there's issues of privacy and all of that, but you know, as one option with rapid testing, how do we aggregate all of that and how do we keep tabs on it?
Well, you know, I think that obviously privacy issues are important considerations, but you know, that there's going to have to be some sharing and some contact tracing in order to adequately make sure that people are informed in a timely manner so that they can quarantine, get tested. But there are tools that are available. You know, Apple, Google. There's many small vendors that have the kind of apps that I talked about yesterday, where one both keeps track of your personal health data that can, you know, come from Fitbits and other types of wearables, but also as the diagnostic tests get closer to home and you start doing home testing, you know, those are the things that people really should religiously begin to input into those apps so that everybody has, you know, so that there's a comprehensive picture of what the population level prevalence is. And, you know, these kinds of things will, you know, can be integrated with the other technologies I talked about, such as wastewater monitoring and pooled testing. But again, you know, I think that there are obviously going to be some privacy concerns, and you know, people have those concerns, and we're just going to have to deal with those as we do with, you know, everything that involves imperfect information. We're just going to have to probably bring in some modeling into the system as well.
And messaging, and I think, you know, we're pushing on all fronts, right? We're pushing on therapeutics, we're pushing on diagnostics, we're pushing on all fronts. But at the core of all of this is messaging to the public. You know, I'm a product of growing up, and we had all these PSA campaigns that taught us about things, you know, when we were in school. And in terms of communicating to the public, what role do you see that being, and do you see these large communication campaigns to get everyone's buy-in on this rapid diagnostic testing, or you know, to get mass vaccination up to a certain percentage? Can you speak a bit to the communication element? That was to David.
As I indicated in my remarks about the committee, you know, I think the whole scientific community, the clinical community, and engineering community recognizes that these issues, as I said, of social and behavioral sciences are absolutely essential. And, you know, just hammering home the point that, you know, it's important to get a vaccine, you know, that is not going to do it. There are some very good studies that are coming out now about how we really need to engage with the public to make sure that our message gets across. And it's not, you know, sort of business as usual and communicating in the way that, you know, trying to convince them that you know, science and technical solutions have all the answers. It's really about communicating that there's you know, value to them, to their families, to the people around them, and it's also about engendering true behavioral changes. We've seen, for example, that going, you know, down the street and telling somebody to put their mask on has almost the opposite effect to what is intended. And, you know, there are now ways to engage with people in a, you know, very deliberate way that come from good behavioral sciences that engender them to actually begin to you know, take responsibility for that don't have to do with you know, making them feel guilty or, you know, challenging their notion of you know, their own free will.
Well said. Our next question is for Dan. So Dan, is there a lesson related to high density public transit versus a future and driverless point-to-point transit as a healthier choice?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, one of the big pushes I mentioned on these three revolutions was really the intersection of electrification, sharing, and automation. One scenario is a fleet of robo-taxis that are all electrified, that on demand deliver you to where you need to be. Of course, for those systems to actually work in a meaningfully well way, obviously in dense urban areas, we're just out of land to move all these vehicles. So you need to put multiple people in those vehicles in order for them to effectively deliver high throughput people. If we're not able to make those modes in ways that we can either socially distant or clean them efficiently, it puts into question whether or not those modes are going to basically serve us well when times are normal, but not be able to move efficiently people in mass in a future pandemic. So I think there's definitely a lot of things that we're going to learn out of how we've currently managed public transportation and air travel. By and large, we haven't observed, as far as I've seen, major clusters on public transit. It's a little bit challenging to understand the dynamics simply because the ridership numbers are so low. But I think we're definitely going to be looking for detailed investigations of what has happened in COVID-19 on these high density modes to try to chart some lessons to making those automated shared mobility futures still possible or reevaluating them.
Great, thanks. I have one more question for you, Dan, so we're going to continue on that. Regarding your comments that rideshare transportation has dropped by nearly 70% this year, how can engineering address this in the future? given we have shifted to a very large gig economy, we now have a workforce that is left with no income and healthcare coverage or security. What recommendations does this panel have to protect those workers in the future?
Yeah, I think two pieces that come up in there. One, it's interesting to look at what some of those rideshare companies have done in terms of pivoting their business. They've moved quite a few of them to food delivery, which is also performing an essential role in some communities. In terms of how to protect those operators in the future, I think it's a really interesting question, right? That in the case of public transportation, in the case of the airlines, the operators of those modes are employees. And in the case of Uber and Lyft, I mean, there's been a lot of legal fights to try to classify those drivers not as employees. And so now it becomes a little bit interesting when you need your non-employees to take certain actions to the benefit of the public health overall, what levers you actually have to do that. So I think the question geared towards how do we protect the driver is really important and spans beyond just the pandemic. How we can, I mean, of course you can put in physical separation to try to keep them safe, but long-term there's a challenge just in how we've set up those drivers as non-employees in those rideshare services.
Great answer. Okay, pivoting a bit on a similar theme though. So we're going to talk about inequity. There's a couple questions about this. So one question we have is, how can engineering address the inequity we've seen during this pandemic so that it's not repeated in the future? Specifically, how can we ensure communities of color have access to affordable healthcare and are not disproportionately exposed due to their role in our workforce? But I'm gonna broaden this first, because I know that Sabina, you discussed the need for data in addressing pandemics and poverty. And I know you also said that the engineering minds need to address this, of course, but I wanted to get a little more in depth on your thoughts on data and its role in addressing pandemics and poverty.
We work with many governments on their national multidimensional poverty measures. And I should explain, I do apologize. I'm in a town that has lost electricity. So I'm on my cell phone. I apologize. In Colombia, for example, they had a recent census, and in terms of privacy, they had to adjust their privacy laws. But because they had very micro data about poverty, they joined that with health records, they joined that with access to health services, and they were able to roll out a very powerful response to the COVID pandemic that was very targeted at different people given the information that they had. And that's very different from other countries that have data that are much older, and so you have to do micro simulations or rapid surveys, socioeconomic impact surveys to try to get a bead, as Afghanistan did or as Angola has done. So what we observe as people alongside government trying to do the policies on poverty is that to identify the vulnerable people, it's just much easier if you have a very good data apparatus, and it's much more challenging where that has failed and the governments are not able to identify the populations at risk or respond as quickly, even if they would wish to and have the resources to do so.
Thank you for clarifying that and explaining the role of data more. I know we don't have a specific speaker to address this question directly, but I was curious if anyone else would like to answer this, and engineering's role in addressing inequity during the pandemic and in future pandemics.
I'll take a stab at it. You know, one of the things, just from my own experience with the pandemic at Mass General and Brigham, is that we started some implementation working groups that are really going out into the community, but the idea is really not to consider people as research subjects, but as participants. And I think it's really about engaging communities in the right way, making sure that you give them something that they want. Some of our projects, we're running some diagnostic tests for them But in addition to that, we're providing them with groceries because, you know, it's something that some of these communities don't have access to. And this applies at the global level as well. I think it's our responsibility as engineers, and you know, not to just be complicit and create these technologies and run projects that benefit you know, those who are willing to pay. But I think there is a social responsibility as well. And I'm glad, you know, that Pam mentioned with AstraZeneca, that, you know, this is really a nonprofit. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that the entire profession looks at this as a community responsibility to ensure that we're not simply driven by, you know, making products and profit motive, but really making sure that we're helping address the problem in an equitable way.
Deanne, do you mind if I jump in for a sec?
Go for it. I'd love for you to, Pam.
Thank you. I think David makes a great point. So I want to give you a specific example about what we're thinking about in terms of this particular vaccine, for example, for the developing countries and the poor countries, for example. I think, you know, we as engineers, I'm a chemical engineer by training myself, we as engineers has an obligation not only to design products for for the wealthy countries and patients, for example, we also need to be thinking about the less fortunate, right? So on this particular vaccine, for example, you know, if you look at the cost of this vaccine, you know, these glass vials, so the glass vials are expensive, right? So whether or not, you know, if it's a pre-filled syringe, if it's a auto injector or whatever the case may be, they become expensive. So meanwhile, some of the mature markets may demand some of this convenience features and certain presentations, but we as engineers have an obligation to say, are there innovations out there such that we can manufacture this in a less expensive way, and it's less convenient, but nevertheless, it doesn't compromise the medicine that we are delivering, and we'll be able to really drive the affordability element of a medicine that is going to be good for the global population, if you will. So there are specific examples where I think engineers across the industry often think about in terms of, hey, if this is a life-saving drug or vaccine, how do we make sure we're not just designing it for the United States and Western Europe, for example, but we're designing this for the other countries as well.
Really great comments there. Next, we have a couple questions about workforce. So Bill, I'd like to address a few questions to you. Two of these I think can be bundled together. One is, what are examples of future technical jobs for non-college grads? And as well, it's mentioned that looking in the future, we need different skills. Should we revise the curriculum of engineering degree programs? I think they both get at the same thing of what do we need to train for the future to be more prepared?
Well, I think as we have more and more automation and AI and other things, one of the primary roles people are going to serve is basically being able to figure out what went wrong. Why are things not operating the way they should, and what went wrong? And that's pretty sophisticated technical skills to be able to do that. Some of it can be proceduralized. Some of it, people will have to learn more fundamentals. I don't mean thermodynamics or quantum physics, but I mean more fundamentals about how these systems work. And so I think the ability to understand how systems work and how to work those systems is going to be a substantial number of jobs in that area. Like I mentioned, the top two jobs in the Bureau of Labor Statistics are installing solar panels and maintaining wind turbines. That's the two fastest growing jobs. And obviously those require some technical background and skill. So I think that is a crucial issue. The curriculum will have to change, but it wouldn't change so much at the community colleges. I think they're used to educating people to do these kinds of jobs. I guess the bigger issue, and this is really sort of an aside, but hearing some of the other presentations, what do we do with the massive immigrants who do not have any education and say don't speak English. What kind of jobs can they get? Because a lot of these jobs are going to become automated. And so I don't know how we absorb that end of the population. I think what we really need to do is for the portion of the population I'm talking about, is really upskill them and so they can take these jobs. But there's still a portion of the population just not going to be ready to do that. And I'm not sure how we deal with that. That's one of the reasons I like the idea of 100% high school graduation. That if you're a student who struggles and would maybe just leave school or whatever, that you get extra help. So we just make sure that you get up to that level. This is certainly true in other countries, more so than here, that we need to look out for everybody. But I do think the curricula will need to change. But I don't know that, I don't really have any implications for the typical liberal arts bachelor's degree. We've done some stuff that we've just published recently, John Lombardi and Mike Johns and I, basically showing that the low end of the educational institutions that are not well resourced, as this goes on, are going to really struggle. The percentage of less resourced universities will just go out of business or get absorbed is going to be substantial. And so there's going to be quite a bit of disruption. It's kind of amazing to me that we have about 20 million students in four-year universities and only 10 in community colleges. I think what that means is there's a whole bunch of people that just don't go anywhere. They don't go to college. They don't go to community college. They just, live day to day, paycheck to paycheck. I think we need to, I actually think some of these inequities, like we've seen in the pandemic in terms of the poorer communities and disadvantaged communities, we've done some studies of this in Washington, D.C., that we need to get those people moving up the economic ladder. Having education, having good jobs means it's more likely they're going to have health care. They're going to be educated enough to know how to pay attention to things. In some sense, our response to the pandemic has been late. We could be anticipating the disruption of natural habitats and what happens to the animals that are stressed out in those habitats, and then people eat them. And I mean, that's just one path, but there's an awful lot of things that we could be dealing with much earlier than we deal with now. I mean, I think we shouldn't be, we want to get rid of the problem of having to deal with someone being in poverty by making sure they aren't in poverty.
Yeah, and can we explore virtual work specifically? Obviously, a lot of us have been thrust into virtual work, and many have not had that opportunity. But do we see the growing advancements in virtual work? Do we see that creating opportunity, or are graduating more high school graduates with this virtual opportunity, or having more engineers come back to the workforce potentially because they have that flexibility to work from home? Do you want to speak to that at all?
Well, let's think about in the US, there are 100 million disabled and older adults, a third of the country. They could use a lot of services that would help them work. Many more people who are disabled could work than do now. Many elderly people could age in place, not go to institutional living and just stay in their homes. And that would save an enormous amount of money that we could spend on training people to help them. And I think some of the help can be, a lot of it can be remote. You don't have to be in their house, but you've got to be trained to do it. I've seen in family circumstances, situations where the healthcare workers who came were really poorly paid and not trained at all. And so they really didn't know what they were doing other than just watch the elderly person. I think we could train people to become first-class home healthcare workers. And a lot of that, again, I think could happen remotely because people are used to now interacting on devices. I mean, one of my friends they had a remote monitoring device, and he went around and talked to some of the elderly people who were using this monitoring device for entering in their vitals to go back to the hospital. And he found with some of the elderly people, they had actually befriended this device and told it everything about their lives because they had nobody else to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a tremendous amount of needs that could be met remotely. You know, telehealth has just taken off during the pandemic.
Definitely. Okay, we have some more questions here, which I think go back to more towards the vaccine side and the diagnostics. So we had one about COVID-19 survivors, and is there any research or reports or anyone that wants to shed light on any of the lasting disabilities and what can be done to help those that have survived COVID-19, if there are?
So I give it a try then. I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm going to refrain from talking about the lingering sort of symptoms. I think monoclonal antibody is actually a potential sort of a very effective treatment option for people who have contracted the virus, for example, right? So I think in the end of the day, it's not just the vaccines that's going to save the day. I think it's also things like the monoclonal antibody that can actually be preventative as well as treatment. So it really kind of, if you think about sort of frontline healthcare workers, for example, it could be a good measure that they can take. And for those populations that have immune compromised systems, for example, the monoclonal antibody could be a great treatment as well. So I think in the end of the day, we don't know a lot right now. I think we're still learning as we go. We will continue to learn as we go, particularly around the lingering symptoms and health implications after you've contracted it. But I think the first thing we got to work on is to make sure that people stop dying from it. That we can use things like the monoclonal antibody to save lives, and the treatment options to save lives. And then I believe in science and innovation, and I really do believe that the more we know as we learned, we'll come up with solutions for them.
I think some of it just goes back to David's, in addition to what Pam said, to David's comments about real world data and how we use that real world data, right? So we collect plasma from many convalescent people who have had COVID, and we track their antibody levels over time. Now, there's not an exact equation for every person, right? So that's going to take a continuation of assembling this data to understand, do they get reinfections? What levels can work to protect them? That's not known right now from a scientific viewpoint. So it's really about getting the right real world evidence with, not tens or 20s, but thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and making this, as we get home testing available, how can we also follow up with antibody levels? Because even for the vaccines to be successful, we're going to have to know what antibody level the vaccine promotes and creates and sustains for the vaccine to be successful as well. So there's a lot of real world data that really needs to come in and data analytics to make it happen.
Deanne, I think that the questioner was also asking something a little bit different, which is about what I think is now being termed long haulers. The people who become infected and recover, but it just takes a very long time for them to get back to normal, if ever. And I think the one thing about COVID-19 that I think has surprised all the infectious disease experts that I know is that it's not really predictable what symptoms will develop. People react to it very differently. Some people have gastrointestinal issues, some have neurological issues, and I think that one of the things that I think is just beginning to be discussed in the community is, we're going to have this burden of the recovering COVID-19 patients as a long-term healthcare issue in this country and the world for the next generation. And you know, I think it's really going to open up a lot of not just research, but also there's going to be opportunities for therapies and other ways of helping these, you know, what will become disabled people to the point that some other folks made earlier. So you know, we're just at the beginning of this, and I think, you know, this is not just about you know, getting people out of the hospital or getting, you know, or applying vaccines. We're going to have to deal with these issues for a long time.
And I think that underscores subjects of your plenary yesterday, that it's not like there's one solution. I mean, there's so many different angles, and I think they're all getting pushed. And I don't know if there is a scenario where, you know, one rises to the top. And we've talked about this race, and everyone's developing, but it sounds like there's a multi-pronged, you know, solution, and there's so much more to discover. But I think to go back to, we have one more question, Pan, about vaccines, or actually it's about more the manufacturing. Someone wanted you to elaborate on what your team is doing differently to compress the capital project from 78 weeks down to 21 weeks. Is it straightforward as working 24/7 over multiple shifts, or I guess there are no equipment lead time constraints? How are you managing project risks in such an intensive environment?
Oh, I think Paul can speak to this as well. I think, so first of all, I think it's the ingenuity and creativity by our staff and lots of engineers, where things would have taken, you know, 2 weeks to do is now getting done in a day or two, right? So really, and I think it's also rid of all the system noise. So there's no bureaucracy, there's no complexity. It's about getting the stuff done. So I think that says a lot about how we are doing that as well. It's also 24/7. I mean, literally, we've set up shift patterns, and we brought in firms, and we brought in temporary staff, for example. So I think that also is absolutely helping. The other thing we do in the time of pandemic, which is unique to the time of pandemic, is equipments we need. We did need to procure it and source equipment and parts and so on and so forth. And we do, we see significant sort of collaboration from our suppliers, right? So we are absolutely bumped to the priority level with respect to other business they have, for example, because knowing that this is for COVID-19. So there's huge level of support. Many governments step in to help to make sure that we are getting the support that we need. Just think glass vials for the vaccines, billions of them. And we are not the only company trying to procure them. There are many companies out there, right? So really it takes quite a bit of collaboration and orchestration to kind of get that done. But I think it's sort of all of the above, right? The energy, the passion of the engineer, the creativity, sort of engineering parts. You know, I talked about yesterday, we had over 100 parts that needed to be retrofitted. And our engineers took it upon themselves to design it, to fabricate it, to assemble it, to test it. It's not normally their job. But they did it because we didn't have the time to go out to a shop, to go to a supplier, to try to define the parts. So I think at a time of, my thing is, at a time of pandemic, it really, most of the time it brings out the best part in people, and it brings the best out of us, and put our best foot forward.
Paul, did you want to add anything to that in terms of compressing time schedules?
No, I think some of it, Pam highlighted, but some of it's just laser focus on the solution. Sometimes we try to build in the ultimate flexibility, where here we really need to drive standards. And, you know, to Pam's point, a multi-dose vial should be sufficient to get us kicked off. I'll give another example of, you know, inserts into pharmaceutical products. Many people have received books where you look and you can barely even read the font. Well, why aren't they all electronic, right? Even just getting that label insert and instruction written up, done, converted to 56 languages is much easier done electronic than in paper. So approaching regulatory agencies, I think working well with regulatory agencies and government has been extremely important, and the speed of those interactions has improved significantly because they're all tasked with also collaborating and making a difference. So that's the only point I'd add to Pam's comment.
Great, thanks. We have one question here, which I think will be a good one in terms of us reflecting on lessons learned and preventing future pandemics. What measures are necessary to prevent future pandemics? So it's a big question. I'd love to get thoughts from anyone who wants to answer. Why don't we start with David?
Well, I think that probably the most important thing to implement is a global surveillance system that where it's not only left to local governments and national governments. This is really, and I think this, this was the intention right from the beginning, but the different countries behave differently. And the important thing is that we have a recognition that that there is a surveillance system in place where public health systems are interconnected globally, where the means for making decisions is done sort of at the international level. We cannot leave it up to individual countries to close their borders or decide whether they're going to allow international travel. I'm not sure. I mean, this is more about social engineering than it is about technology engineering. I think the technologies exist. We have the ability to know fairly quickly when there is a cluster of infection, and then we have to be able to mobilize the global community to ensure that it does not get outside of the local area before we can, before the cat's out of the bag, as it did with COVID-19.
Dan, if I can add to that, I think the other elements of that can be very effective in preventing this is the notion of lessons learned, growing a memory, right? So you take an example like Taiwan. Now, one can argue it's a small country, it's an island. So be it, but they have single-digit deaths. Why? Because they learned from SARS, right? So they took it very seriously. They took measures right away. And many of the countries around the world did that. But in the end of the day, I think we must learn from this and we must grow that memory, and we got to be prepared.
Does anyone else want to address measures necessary to prevent future pandemics?
Well, Deanne, I just want to make it clear that that's not, the surveillance is not the only thing. There's lots of lessons, some of which I described in my plenary yesterday, where it's simply being prepared, having supplies, making sure that we're ramped up and not waiting for things like PPE, that we prepare in advance. I think Pam alluded to that. So we just have to be prepared on all fronts. My point was simply that surveillance, I think, is probably the way to your question. How do we avoid it in the first place? I think that's the most important thing, is monitoring and surveillance will prevent it from getting, becoming a global event in the future. We were able to control both SARS and MERS, probably because their transmission factors were lower, but their mortality and morbidity were much greater for those people who got infected, but we did control them. I think it was just a question of, clamping down on things sooner. We've done the same thing with Ebola outbreaks. The community as a global effort mobilizes international experts to go to those sites and make sure that treatments occur. In this case, it just appeared as sort of a flu-like disease, and we just didn't take it seriously enough.
I might pick up very quickly on the Ebola example, only to say that that was, in some senses, an example of how the pandemic also triggered off work on wider aspects of poverty. So I mentioned we looked at 75 countries, and the fastest country to reduce multidimensional poverty was Sierra Leone, and it did it during the Ebola pandemic. And so that did prove a time when, in order to address the pandemic, you needed to look at health systems, you need to deliver nutritional supplies into schools and mobilize communities. And so that has had also a lasting impact in a positive way. So it's not preventing pandemics, but it's also using them to look at some broader issues.
Thank you for that. So we are ending the end of our forum, and we have discussed so much. And so thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions. But before we end, I want to give each of our speakers a moment. We're going to do kind of like a rapid fire, like about 30-second little parting remarks. So we're going to go ahead and start. Why don't we start with Dan and give some final comments?
Deanne, yeah, I'd like to pick up on that last thread there. I mean, our transportation systems are going to continue to accelerate how we move people around. And so if we don't get the ability to get information quickly to make decisions, we're going to continue to have trouble to address future pandemics. At the end of the day, we have not been able to decouple access from mobility, the distinction of access being getting access to jobs, food, et cetera, and physically moving you to do those things. So as long as we're moving people, we run the risk of moving virus along with it. We need to be able to see what's going on, use the data that is now becoming available in our transportation systems to see what's happening and be able to track this before it gets too far.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Bill.
Yeah, I think that we need to get much better at anticipating challenges rather than letting them happen and then dealing with them, waiting until the bridge falls down and then dealing with it. Especially with the looming climate change and global warming, there's going to be no vaccine for sea level rise.
Great, thank you, Bill. All right, next we'll go to Pam.
Thank you. I think that was well said by Bill. I think sustainability is going to be a huge issue. I think the world is going to look at sustainability differently after the pandemic. And I think the best thing that we need to do is, I wish we are more focused in fighting against this pandemic globally. I think there's a lot of distractions at the moment in many parts of the world. And I think if we become more focused, science-based, data-driven, we'll get through this together. And I think life coming out of this will be completely different, whether it's jobs or the way we get healthcare and where we do our jobs. And I think we all need to stay open-minded and be flexible.
Great, thanks. I know we're a little over, but we're going to get to everyone. So Sabina, 30 seconds, last parting thoughts.
I really appreciated the emphasis in many speakers about the need for equity in delivering the vaccine. And we had a General Assembly event at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago with heads of state and ministers on leadership in COVID and poverty. And I think trying to continue to engage that recognition that in order to have an equitable response, we actually need to be proactive. We need leaders who make decisions, and getting their voices and their energies would be useful. And finding good historical examples, which we do have during World War II when life expectancy went up in Britain, or examples of good responses in other contexts, and reminding people that it's possible, but you have to be quite intentional in order to make sure that it's equitably distributed across the populations.
Great, next to Paul.
Yeah, just a quick thank you to all the essential workers out there, not only in the manufacturing plants, but the hospitals and alike. And I hope 2020 actually reinvigorates the STEM efforts and the scientific learning from the elementary schools on out through the colleges. That would be a great outcome of what's been a very difficult year.
All right, and David. You're on mute.
I think what we've seen is an incredible coming together of, as I said yesterday, scientists, engineers, and clinicians. I think that has resulted in just an amazing array of capability and capacity. But to the point I just made, it's a global problem. It requires global solutions. Locally, it's a national problem that requires a national solution with national standards for validation and regulation. And I think we really need to at some point accept that that we cannot solve these problems city by city, town by town, state by state, but we need to really come together both as a nation, but also as a nation among the global population, because it's exactly as we heard a few minutes ago. It's not about who can pay for diagnostics, for therapeutics, for vaccines. The problem is one that affects everyone, and everyone should have access equally.
Thank you. That wraps up our forum. I just want to echo what everyone said. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists for everything you're doing to address the pandemic and for sharing your insights with us. I want to thank everyone who's attended today for being a part of this and asking such informed questions. And as everyone said, it's a global call to action, and we're all engineers. We all have expertise, and it's our time to innovate and to help make this world a better place. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Al. We really appreciate everyone participating today, and Al, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deanna. Well, yes, thank you to the entire panel, and thank you to you, Deanne. That was absolutely excellent. You gave us some marvelous insights into this very, very important topic and challenge. I'd also like the audience to please join me in thanking our entire team, the program committee, the NAE staff, our IT support team. All of us work together to bring this program to you, and I hope you found it as exciting and informative as I and many other members have. Just a reminder that we'll be now on a break for about an hour, and then we'll reconvene at 3:30 Eastern Time, where NAE President John Anderson will introduce John Slaughter, who will present our special lecture on racial justice and equality. So please join us in about an hour. Thank you so much.